They thought 72 hours was enough to erase a family legacy, but the oldest piece of paper in the county had been waiting more than 60 years to prove them wrong. The certified envelope was still warm from the morning sun when I pulled it out of my mailbox. Thick cream-colored paper, gold-embossed HOA seal. My name printed in bold black letters, as if someone wanted the whole county to know they had finally cornered me. I broke the seal with my thumb while the breeze carried the clean scent of lake water across the dock behind my house. A pair of loons drifted through the morning mist, their calls echoing over 600 acres of glass-smooth water that my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. The first sentence made my stomach tighten. I had exactly 72 hours to surrender exclusive ownership of Walker Lake to the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. According to the notice, the lake had always been intended as a community recreational asset, and my continued claims supposedly violated updated neighborhood agreements. They demanded I sign the enclosed transfer documents before noon on Friday. If I refused, they promised immediate legal action, financial penalties, and a court order that would permanently strip me of every acre of shoreline my family had owned for generations. I looked up from the letter toward the water, watching sunlight spread across the surface like molten silver. My grandfather used to say you could tell the mood of a lake by the way it reflected the sky. That morning it looked calm, patient, almost amused, as if it already knew something I didn't. Gravel crunched behind me. A white BMW rolled slowly into my driveway before stopping beside the mailbox. Rebecca Holloway stepped out wearing a perfectly pressed cream blazer, oversized sunglasses, and the confident smile of someone who had never once heard the word no. Even from 20 feet away, I caught the expensive perfume drifting through the humid air. She folded her hands neatly in front of her and nodded toward the envelope. "I assume you've read it," she said. I didn't answer. She continued anyway. 72 hours isn't much time, Ethan, but we wanted to. Be generous. The community has already approved expansion plans. Walking trails, boat rentals, a private marina. Families deserve access to this lake. She said my lake the same way someone talks about an abandoned building they plan to renovate. I glanced past her toward the shoreline where weathered cedar posts still marked property lines my grandfather had installed decades earlier. Every post had survived storms, floods, droughts, and countless winters. Somehow Rebecca believed a freshly printed letter carried more authority than 60 years of history. "You should think carefully," she added with another practiced smile. "Nobody wins against the HOA." Then she climbed back into her SUV and drove away, leaving nothing behind except tire tracks, silence, and the faint smell of perfume hanging over the gravel. I stood there listening to small waves tapping against the dock while the paper crackled softly in my hand. Something about the notice felt wrong. Not just unfair. Wrong in the kind of way that makes the back of your neck tingle before your mind catches up. I read every line again. Every signature. Every legal reference. Every survey number. Whoever wrote this document expected me to panic. They expected me to surrender before asking questions. What they couldn't possibly know was that my grandfather never trusted easy answers, and somewhere inside the old storage barn overlooking this lake, he had left behind boxes of records he once told me would matter only if someone ever tried to steal what belonged to our family. The storage barn sat about 300 yards from the house, tucked beneath a stand of towering oak trees that had watched over the shoreline longer than anyone still living. The old wooden doors groaned as I pulled them open, releasing the familiar smell of aged pine, machine oil, dry hay, and decades of quiet memories. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight cutting between weathered boards, and for the first time since my grandfather's funeral 6 years earlier, I found myself standing exactly where he had spent countless afternoons repairing fishing boats, sharpening tools, and reminding me that land was something you earned. Every single day, even after you owned it. Walker Lake had never been just another piece of property. My grandfather, Samuel Walker, bought the original 200 acres surrounding the shoreline in 1964 after returning from years of working construction projects across Texas. Every overtime paycheck, every weekend job, every sacrifice eventually became another section of shoreline until the property reached 600 acres. He used to laugh whenever people asked why anyone needed that much water. Then he would point toward the horizon and say, "Nobody truly owns a lake, Ethan. We only promise to take care of it until the next generation is ready. Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. My father kept that promise. So did I. Every spring I inspected the docks before fishing season began. Every summer I cleared fallen trees after storms rolled through. Every fall I checked the shoreline for erosion. And every winter I repaired fences and gates while cold winds swept across the open water. I was not some wealthy investor hiding behind lawyers and accountants. I was a civil engineer who spent weekdays inspecting bridges and drainage systems across the county before coming home to maintain the place that had shaped every chapter of my life. The lake gave back far more than it ever took. Families rented small cabins during the summer. Local school science classes visited the wetlands each year. Veterans gathered quietly on the eastern dock every Memorial Day before sunrise. I allowed all of it because my grandfather believed good stewardship meant sharing beauty without surrendering responsibility. That balance had worked perfectly for decades. Then Willow Ridge began expanding. What started as 50 custom homes slowly transformed into hundreds of expensive properties stretching toward my western shoreline. New streets replaced open fields. Decorative stone entrances appeared where cattle once grazed. Golf carts became more common than pickup trucks. Somewhere along the way, Rebecca Holloway became president of the Homeowners Association, and almost overnight the language changed. Neighbors stopped saying Mr. Walker's Lake and started calling it the community lake. Real estate brochures described scenic waterfront living without mentioning that the water itself belonged entirely to someone else. I noticed strangers setting up picnic chairs near my docks, assuming they had every right to be there because a glossy marketing flyer had quietly rewritten reality. I stayed patient. I installed additional signs. I politely explained the property boundaries whenever someone wandered too far. Most people apologized and left with a smile. Rebecca never did. Looking back, I realized those little misunderstandings had never been accidents. They were small pieces of a much larger picture, carefully arranged until enough people believed the same story. Standing inside the barn, surrounded by shelves my grandfather had built with his own hands, I ran my fingers across faded labels on old filing boxes. Tax records, survey maps, water permits, insurance binders. Decades of careful organization filled every shelf. My grandfather documented everything because he believed memories could fade, but paper could still speak when the truth needed a voice. I pulled the first filing box onto my grandfather's old workbench, brushing away a layer of dust that smelled like dry cedar and faded summers. Every folder was labeled in his careful handwriting, arranged by year instead of subject because, as he always said, the truth made more sense when you followed time instead of emotion. I had barely opened the first stack of property tax receipts when my phone buzzed. Another electronic notice from the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association had arrived. This one informed me that survey crews would be conducting a community shoreline assessment the following morning. Community shoreline. They were already speaking as though ownership had changed. I drove into town that afternoon, partly to clear my head and partly because I wanted to see whether anyone else had noticed the language changing. The answer came sooner than I expected. A massive billboard stood at the entrance to Willow Ridge advertising luxury lakefront living. Families smiled from a polished wooden dock that looked strangely familiar. The photograph was taken from my eastern shoreline. The caption beneath it read, "Exclusive waterfront lifestyle for every resident." There was no mention of my family, no mention of private ownership, no mention that every inch of water behind those smiling faces belonged to someone who had never given permission to use it in a marketing campaign. The metallic taste of frustration settled in my mouth as I continued toward the sales office. Inside, glossy brochures covered every table. One map caught my attention immediately. Walker Lake had disappeared completely. In its place, bold blue letters identified the water as Willow Ridge Community Lake. Even the property boundary lines had been redrawn to blend seamlessly into the subdivision. I picked up the brochure and quietly asked the young sales representative whether every resident received lake access. She smiled confidently. Absolutely. The Homeowners Association owns and manages the waterfront amenities. She believed every word she said. I thanked her, folded the brochure, and walked back outside without correcting her. Someone had spent months building this illusion. Rebecca was not simply making outrageous legal claims. She was rewriting the public story one brochure, one meeting, and one conversation at a time. The deeper I looked, the more carefully the pieces fit together. Decorative neighborhood signs had quietly appeared near two public roads pointing visitors toward community lake access. New online listings repeated the same description almost word for word. Even local tourism websites had begun referring to the lake as a shared neighborhood attraction instead of private property. By sunset, I stopped at the county marina where old Frank Delaney was repairing a pontoon boat engine. Frank had known my grandfather for more than 40 years. He wiped grease from his hands and frowned when I showed him the brochure. "Rebecca has been saying that for over a year," he admitted. "She kept telling people the paperwork was almost finished. Most folks figured she already had permission." His words landed harder than the legal notice had. Permission. That was the foundation of the entire scheme. If enough people accepted the story, before anyone questioned the documents, the truth would begin to sound like the lie. As I drove home, orange light reflected across the calm water while the tires hummed softly over the county road. The lake looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, steady, completely unaware that strangers had been selling its future without ever owning a single inch of it. Back inside the barn, I spread the brochures beside my grandfather's carefully organized records. One stack contained decades of documented facts. The other contained polished fiction. Somewhere between those two piles was the reason Rebecca sounded so confident when she handed me 72 hours. She was not gambling. She believed whatever was hidden inside those records would never be found. The next morning arrived with a blanket of low fog drifting across the water, and by 7 o'clock I could already hear diesel engines humming somewhere beyond the western shoreline. The sound rolled across the lake long before I saw the trucks themselves. 3 white pickup trucks carrying surveying equipment eased through the newly built subdivision entrance, each one displaying magnetic signs with the logo of a local engineering company I recognized. They were professionals, not trespassers looking for trouble. That made what happened next even more unsettling. Rebecca climbed out of her white BMW with a clipboard tucked under one arm and greeted the survey crew as though she already owned every acre surrounding the water. I watched from my dock without saying a word while the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the cool scent of damp cedar drifting off the shoreline. One of the surveyors noticed me and offered a polite wave before walking over. "Good morning, sir," he said. "We are verifying shoreline boundaries for the Homeowners Association Expansion Project." Expansion Project. Even hearing the words spoken aloud felt strange. I asked if they had copies of the property authorization. He immediately handed me a packet, clearly believing everything had already been approved. The top page contained a clean color map with bright blue boundary lines. According to their documents, almost 1/3 of my shoreline had somehow become designated as future community waterfront, boat launch, picnic area, fishing pier, scenic walking trail. Every proposed improvement sat entirely inside property that my family had maintained for decades. The surveyor apologized after noticing my expression. "We only work from the documents our client provides," he explained. "If there is a title issue, that is above our pay grade." I thanked him because none of this was his fault. Rebecca, however, smiled as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. She walked across the gravel parking area without any hurry, her heels clicking softly against the pavement before stopping a few feet away. "You see, Ethan," she said calmly, "the community is already moving forward. Investors do not wait forever." Behind her, workers unloaded orange stakes and measuring equipment while sunlight slowly burned away the morning fog. It looked less like a survey and more like the beginning of a future everyone except me had already accepted. "You still have time to cooperate," she continued. "Once construction begins, this entire area will become one of the most desirable waterfront communities in the county. Think about what that means for everyone." Everyone except the man who actually owned the land, I thought quietly. I looked past Rebecca toward the water where an old wooden fishing pier stretched into the lake. My grandfather and I had built that pier together one summer when I was 14 years old. Every board had been measured twice before we drove a single nail. I could still remember the rough texture of unfinished cedar beneath my hands and the smell of fresh sawdust floating over the water. Rebecca followed my eyes and smiled politely. "That dock will eventually be replaced with something more modern," she said as if she were discussing landscaping instead of family history. I said nothing. Silence has a way of making confident people reveal more than they intend. She thanked the survey crew, reminded them to finish before the weekend, then drove away without ever looking back. As her vehicle disappeared beyond the subdivision entrance, one detail on the survey packet caught my attention. In tiny print beneath the revised shoreline map sat a reference number identifying the supporting property record filed only 8 months earlier. My grandfather had been gone for 6 years. My father had passed away before that. No legitimate property record affecting this lake should have appeared only 8 months ago. For the first time since opening that certified letter, I stopped feeling overwhelmed. Instead, I felt curious, because someone had not simply rewritten a story. Someone had rewritten an official record, and official records always leave footprints. That tiny reference number stayed in my mind the entire drive to the county records office the following morning. The courthouse had not changed much since I was a kid. The same limestone walls reflected the afternoon sun, the same bronze flagpole stood in front of the entrance, and the same old clock above the lobby still seemed to run a minute slow. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, aging paper, and fresh coffee drifting from a small break room down the hall. County records had always fascinated me because they never cared about opinions. They only cared about dates, signatures, stamps, and facts. If someone had truly changed the history of Walker Lake, those facts would either expose the truth or reveal exactly where it had been hidden. I handed the clerk the property reference number printed beneath the survey map. She typed quietly for several seconds before pausing with a puzzled expression. "That is unusual," she said. "This filing references an amended shoreline exhibit, but it is linked to a much older property record." She printed a copy and slid it across the counter. At first glance, it looked official enough. County seal, filing stamp, legal descriptions. But something immediately felt off. The amendment referred to shoreline boundaries using terminology that had not existed when my grandfather purchased the property in 1964. Modern planning language had somehow appeared inside documents supposedly connected to a transaction completed decades earlier. My years as a civil engineer had taught me to notice small inconsistencies because major failures usually begin with tiny details everyone else overlooks. I requested the original deed history instead of the amendment. The clerk disappeared into a secured archive room and returned several minutes later carrying a thick binder filled with certified copies dating back more than 60 years. As she placed it on the counter, she smiled politely. "Most people never ask for the originals anymore," she said. I carefully turned each page, following the chain of ownership one document at a time. My grandfather's purchase, property tax confirmations, water rights registration, easement agreements. Everything matched the stories I had heard growing up. Then I reached the section where the amendment supposedly connected to the historical file. There was an obvious gap. A reference existed for the new exhibit, but the supporting attachment it claimed to replace was missing entirely. Instead of panic, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Missing records almost always leave administrative fingerprints. Files do not simply disappear without someone creating a trail. Before leaving, I asked whether archived survey books from the 1960s were still available for public review. The clerk nodded and pointed toward the basement archive, explaining that most had been digitized but the original field books were preserved because surveyors occasionally needed to verify historical monuments. The basement was cool, quiet, and lined with rows of gray shelving that stretched farther than I expected. After nearly an hour of searching, I found a worn leather volume labeled 1964. Inside were handwritten survey notes, bearing initials I immediately recognized. My grandfather had hired one of the most respected licensed surveyors in the state at the time, and every boundary marker around the lake had been documented with remarkable precision. Tucked between two brittle pages rested something that did not belong there. Folded neatly was a thin sheet of tracing paper covered with handwritten corrections, each initialed and dated by the original surveyor only weeks after the first survey was completed. One notation circled the western shoreline and stated that all future community development must remain outside the privately established lake boundary. I stared at those words while the faint smell of old paper filled the room. Rebecca had built her entire claim around the western shoreline. But 62 years earlier, someone had already anticipated exactly this kind of dispute and documented the answer long before Willow Ridge existed. By the time I walked out of the county archives, the afternoon sun had turned the courthouse steps almost white with heat, but my mind was clearer than it had been since that certified letter arrived. The tracing paper had answered one question, yet it created three more. Who had attached the amended shoreline exhibit only 8 months earlier? Why was the original supporting document missing from the public file? And how had Rebecca become so certain that nobody would notice the difference? I resisted the temptation to confront her immediately. My grandfather had always warned me that timing mattered just as much as evidence. If someone believed they were winning, they usually stopped hiding the small mistakes that eventually exposed everything. Instead of driving home, I headed toward the office of Daniel Brooks, a licensed land surveyor whose family had worked in the county for 3 generations. Daniel greeted me with a firm handshake and spread both the historical survey and the recent amendment across a large drafting table illuminated by bright overhead lights. The room smelled of blueprint paper, graphite, and freshly sharpened pencils. For nearly an hour, he compared bearings, monument references, and legal descriptions without saying much. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and tapped one corner of the amended exhibit with his pencil. "This boundary does not fail because somebody made a calculation error," he said quietly. "It fails because it ignores the controlling monument established in the original survey. Whoever prepared this map shifted the reference point. Once you move that monument, every shoreline measurement changes." He looked directly at me before adding, "That is not how legitimate corrections are made." Hearing those words from an independent professional confirmed what my instincts had been telling me all along. I asked Daniel whether he would prepare a written comparison. He agreed, but he also suggested something I had not considered. "Before you file anything," he said, "collect every public statement the Homeowners Association has already made. If they have been presenting this altered boundary as established fact, that timeline could become just as important as the survey itself." On the drive back, I stopped at the subdivision entrance where workers were installing another polished stone sign. It featured a beautifully engraved map showing walking trails looping around the western shoreline exactly where my family's boundary still legally existed. Nobody seemed nervous. Nobody acted as though ownership remained unresolved. The confidence itself became evidence. Over the next several hours, I quietly gathered everything available to the public. Community newsletters, meeting agendas posted online, promotional brochures, archived neighborhood announcements. One after another, they repeated the same claim, each document sounding slightly more certain than the last. What had begun as proposed access gradually transformed into guaranteed ownership, even though no court had ruled on the property and no voluntary transfer had ever taken place. The pattern was impossible to ignore. They were building public expectation first, assuming the paperwork would eventually catch up to the story. That evening, I returned to the dock, just as the sky turned shades of orange and deep blue. Gentle waves brushed against the weathered cedar posts my grandfather and I had installed years ago, producing the same steady rhythm I had heard since childhood. I unfolded the tracing paper once more and laid it beside the newly printed subdivision map. One represented careful measurements recorded by people determined to preserve the truth. The other represented an attractive future built upon a shifted line and an even more dangerous assumption. Rebecca believed the countdown favored her because every passing hour increased the pressure on me. She had no idea that every additional brochure, every public meeting, every new sign, and every confident statement was quietly extending a trail of evidence that pointed back to the same altered boundary. I was no longer racing against the clock. I was allowing the record to finish writing itself. When the 72-hour deadline finally arrived, I did the one thing Rebecca clearly had not expected. I stayed completely quiet. I did not send an angry letter. I did not call the Homeowners Association office. I did not post anything online. Instead, I spent the morning sitting on my grandfather's dock with a legal pad, a thermos of black coffee, and a growing stack of documents arranged in chronological order. The air smelled of fresh water and sun-warmed cedar, while a gentle breeze carried the distant laughter of children from the far side of the lake. Life around the shoreline continued as though nothing unusual was happening, yet every hour added another page to the story Rebecca was writing for herself. Just before noon, my phone vibrated with another electronic notice stating that my failure to cooperate would be interpreted as refusal to comply with the association's lawful demand. The language sounded polished and confident. There was still no court order, no signed judgment, no verified transfer, only assumptions presented as facts. I quietly saved the notice beside the others. Later that afternoon, I drove through Willow Ridge without attracting attention. Workers had already begun placing decorative wooden posts along the route shown on the revised shoreline map. Bright ribbons fluttered from survey stakes planted near my western property line, and a temporary banner announced the future location of the community waterfront trail. Residents walked by smiling, some stopping to admire the view while discussing where the new fishing pier might eventually be built. Nobody questioned whether permission actually existed because they had been hearing the same promise for months. Confidence had become its own form of advertising. I parked across the street and photographed every sign, every posted announcement, and every visible map from public areas. Dates mattered. Locations mattered. Every image quietly documented another step taken before ownership had ever been legally established. Before leaving, I noticed a bulletin board outside the clubhouse displaying minutes from the most recent Homeowners Association meeting. Rebecca's monthly report proudly celebrated progress on the waterfront expansion project and thanked residents for supporting what she described as the association's newly secured lake property. Newly secured. Those two words caught my attention immediately. I photographed the bulletin board from several angles before downloading the same meeting minutes from the association website later that evening. They matched perfectly. Back at home, I spread everything across the long oak table inside the barn. Historical deeds, survey books, archived newsletters, marketing brochures, digital notices, meeting minutes, professional survey analysis. Each document filled another small gap until the entire timeline became impossible to ignore. Rebecca had not relied on one dramatic lie. She had relied on hundreds of small repetitions, each one encouraging people to accept the next without asking where the original authority came from. As darkness settled over the lake, I opened one final folder from my grandfather's collection that I had overlooked earlier in the week. Inside was a handwritten notebook where he recorded conversations with surveyors, county officials, and neighboring landowners during the original purchase. One sentence near the bottom of a yellowed page made me stop turning pages altogether. He had written, "If anyone ever questions the western boundary, verify the monument before reading the map, because maps can be redrawn, but monuments stay where honest people leave them." I smiled without realizing it. That sentence explained everything Daniel had discovered and confirmed exactly where the truth still waited. Rebecca believed the altered paperwork controlled the future. My grandfather understood something far more enduring. Documents could be revised, brochures could be redesigned, and confident speeches could persuade an entire neighborhood. But the original monument marking the boundary still rested exactly where it had been placed more than 60 years earlier, quietly waiting for someone willing to look beyond the newest piece of paper. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, and the county courthouse looked almost unchanged from the first day I had walked through its doors searching for answers. The polished stone floors reflected soft sunlight pouring through tall windows, and the quiet conversations echoing through the hallway carried that familiar mix of confidence and uncertainty that always seems to surround legal disputes. Rebecca arrived surrounded by members of the Homeowners Association Board, all dressed in business attire and carrying matching binders embossed with the association logo. She smiled politely as we passed each other outside the hearing room, the same calm expression she had worn when she handed me the certified notice. She still believed the story she had built over the past year was stronger than the history my family had protected for more than 6 decades. When the proceedings began, the association presented its revised shoreline exhibit, promotional development plans, meeting minutes, and amended property references. Everything looked organized, professional, and convincing. If someone had walked into the room without knowing the history, they might have assumed the matter had already been settled long ago. Then it was my turn. My attorney did not begin with dramatic speeches or emotional arguments. Instead, he placed the original certified deed on the table, followed by the complete chain of title preserved through county records, the historical survey books, the handwritten field notes, Daniel Brooks's independent survey comparison, and finally the folded tracing paper discovered inside the 1964 archive. One document led naturally to the next until every piece fit together like parts of the same map. The room grew noticeably quieter when Daniel explained how the controlling monument established by the original licensed survey governed every later boundary description. He pointed to enlarged photographs showing the monument still standing exactly where it had been placed decades earlier, untouched by time, weather, or neighborhood expansion. Then the county records clerk testified regarding the amended shoreline exhibit filed only 8 months earlier. She confirmed that while the amendment existed within the record system, the supporting attachment referenced by the filing could not be located in the historical archive, creating an unexplained break in the otherwise continuous chain of documentation. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. The documents simply spoke for themselves. The promotional brochures identifying the lake as community property appeared next, followed by dated newsletters, public meeting minutes, and photographs of signs announcing waterfront projects before ownership had ever been legally established. Viewed separately, each item seemed ordinary. Viewed together, they revealed a consistent pattern of presenting assumption as established fact. Rebecca's confidence slowly faded as each date aligned with the next. For the first time since this began, she stopped taking notes and simply listened. After reviewing the complete record, the hearing officer summarized the evidence with remarkable simplicity. Historical ownership had remained continuous. The original boundary monument controlled the legal description. The independent survey confirmed no lawful basis for shifting the western shoreline. Public representations describing the lake as association property were unsupported by the controlling land records. The amended shoreline exhibit required further administrative review before it could carry legal weight. Those words settled over the room with complete calm. There was no shouting, no celebration, and no dramatic confrontation. The truth had arrived exactly the way my grandfather always believed it would, one verified document at a time. As everyone quietly gathered their papers, I noticed Rebecca looking toward the enlarged photograph of the original survey monument resting beside the courtroom display. It was just an aging stone marker surrounded by grass, easily overlooked by anyone searching only for the newest map. Yet that single monument had remained perfectly still while years of assumptions shifted around it. In the end, the oldest landmark on the property proved far more reliable than the newest promises printed on polished paper. The first Saturday after the hearing, I walked down to the dock just before sunrise carrying nothing except a mug of coffee and the weathered notebook my grandfather had left behind. The air was cool enough to raise a light mist above the water, and the lake reflected the pale orange sky so perfectly that it almost looked like another world resting beneath the surface. The same cedar boards creaked softly beneath my boots, the same gentle waves tapped against the old pilings, and somewhere across the water a loon called through the quiet morning exactly as it had on the day everything began. Some places do not celebrate victory. They simply continue being themselves. Over the following weeks, the decorative signs identifying the shoreline as community property quietly disappeared. Updated brochures were withdrawn. Online listings were corrected. The proposed waterfront expansion was suspended while the county completed its administrative review of the amended filing and related records. Neighbors who had believed the advertisements stopped by to apologize, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had accepted a story without realizing another one had existed long before it. I never blamed them. Most people trust what appears official, especially when the same message is repeated often enough. The survey crew returned one final time, this time accompanied by county representatives and Daniel Brooks. Together, they located the original monument exactly where the 1964 field notes described it. The weathered stone rested quietly beneath a patch of tall grass, almost invisible unless someone already knew where to look. Watching the survey equipment confirm measurements first recorded more than 60 years earlier was strangely satisfying. Technology had become more advanced, yet the answer remained exactly where honest work had placed it decades ago. A few days later, I carried my grandfather's notebook back into the storage barn and returned it to the same shelf where I had found it. Around me stood rows of carefully labeled boxes filled with deeds, surveys, tax receipts, permits, and handwritten notes that many people would probably consider ordinary paperwork. I understood something different now. Those boxes contained the memory of a family. They preserved promises that could outlast assumptions, trends, and polished presentations. I locked the barn, walked back toward the shoreline, and paused beside the old fishing pier we had built together when I was 14 years old. The cedar had faded to a soft silver over the years, but every board remained solid because we had taken the time to build it correctly from the beginning. I realized the lake had taught me the same lesson throughout my entire life. Strong foundations rarely attract attention while they are doing their job. They simply remain steady until someone finally needs them. Rebecca believed ownership could be reshaped by confidence, careful marketing, and revised paperwork. My grandfather believed ownership carried responsibility, patience, and respect for the truth. In the end, only one of those ideas proved durable enough to survive. As the morning sun climbed above the trees, light spread slowly across all 600 acres, turning the calm water into a field of gold. I smiled, took one last sip of coffee, and listened to the quiet that had returned to the shoreline. I had never wanted revenge. I never needed applause. Protecting what my family built was enough. Looking across the water, I finally understood what my grandfather meant all those years ago when he said nobody truly owns a lake. We simply accept the responsibility of protecting it until it is time to hand that responsibility to someone else. The papers mattered because they preserved the truth, but the truth mattered because it protected something far greater than property. It protected trust, and I learned that justice does not arrive with the loudest voice in the room. It arrives patiently, one honest record at a time, until even the oldest stone along the shoreline can remind everyone exactly where the real boundary has always been.